Richard Henshaw watched in silence as his daughter's coffin disappeared beneath the earth. Grief consumed him, but at least this painful chapter was over. Until, "Sir, please stop. Your daughter is still alive." A desperate voice shattered the silence. Security moved to restrain the ragged homeless man, but then Richard heard it, a faint sound. Coming from the coffin. Could it be true? Had he buried his daughter alive? Want to know what happens next? Watch until the end for this gripping story full of twists and emotions. Comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more thrilling stories. The wind howled softly through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of ancient oak trees. A thin layer of grey clouds blanketed the sky, casting a dull, lifeless glow over the scene. The air was heavy with grief, thick enough to suffocate. Richard Henshaw stood motionless. His hands, usually steady and firm, trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his black coat. His face, once full of confidence and authority, now carried the weight of unspeakable loss. Before him, a gleaming white coffin lay in its final resting place. Inside it was his daughter, Grace, his only child, his pride, his light. Gone. The priest's voice droned on, reciting words of comfort that barely touched the numbness in Richard's heart. None of this felt real. Just days ago, Grace had been full of life, laughing, walking, talking, and now she was here, cold, still, lifeless. Richard swallowed hard, forcing back the storm inside him. A father should never have to bury his child. The gravediggers lifted their shovels, scooping the first handfuls of dirt. The soil hit the coffin with a dull thud. Finality. Then, a voice cut through the silence. "Sir, please stop. Your daughter is still alive." Gasps erupted. Heads turned. Richard's chest tightened. A man, a ragged, thin figure, staggered forward, his eyes wild with desperation. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt, his hair an unkempt mess. A homeless man. He pushed past mourners, stumbling toward the grave. "You have to listen to me. Don't bury her." Richard barely processed what was happening. A distant part of his mind registered his security team moving in, grabbing the man by the arms. "Get him out of here," someone muttered. The man thrashed against them, screaming, "I saw it. She wasn't dead. They lied to you, the world." Around Richard blurred. His mind screamed at him to ignore it. Grace was gone. The doctors had confirmed it. He had seen her body himself. But then, a sound, so faint, so distant. He thought he imagined it, a muffled noise, from beneath the ground, from inside the coffin. Richard's breath caught in his throat. No, impossible. He took a step closer. The soil trembled. Then, a soft, weak thud. The color drained from his face. More. The first time since this nightmare began, Richard felt something far worse than grief. Terror. For a moment, everything stopped. The wind, the murmurs of the mourners, the scraping of shovels against soil. Richard stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept what he had just heard. That sound. A faint, weak thud, coming from inside the coffin. His breath turned shallow. His hands clenched into fists, fingernails digging into his palms. He turned sharply toward the gravediggers, his voice low and sharp. "Stop digging." The workers hesitated, their shovels hovering above the grave. They glanced at each other, uncertain. "Sir, please open it," the homeless man screamed, still struggling against the security guards. His voice cracked with desperation. "She's alive. You have to believe me." Richard's heart pounded violently. This is madness. Grace was dead. He had seen her body in the hospital. He had signed the documents. She was gone. And yet, he turned to the coffin, staring at it as if willing it to be silent. But then the sound came again, a faint, muffled knock. His stomach dropped. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. "Did you hear that?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. The gravediggers hesitated. One of them swallowed hard. "Sir, it's probably just shifting soil," the priest offered gently. "It happens." "Sometimes—" "No," the homeless man roared. That's her, she's trying to get out. Richard turned to his security team. Let him go. The guards hesitated, but Richard's glare left no room for argument. They released the man, who stumbled forward, breathless. His eyes locked onto Richard's. I know what I heard, the man panted. And so do you. Richard's hands trembled. His rational mind screamed at him to stop this insanity, to trust the doctors, to trust the reports. But his heart was telling him something else. He turned to the gravediggers. Dig it. Hup. Gasps rippled through the mourners. Someone protested. The priest took a cautious step forward. Mr. Henshaw, I understand your pain, but this— Dig it up, Richard bellowed. The force of his voice shook the cemetery. The gravediggers didn't dare question him again. They dropped their shovels and started digging. The tension in the air became suffocating. Every scoop of dirt felt heavier than the last, and then, as the coffin lid was finally exposed, a single desperate thud echoed from inside. Richard's blood ran cold. His daughter was alive. The cemetery fell into chaos, gasps, whispers, panicked cries. Some mourners stepped back in horror, while others clutched their mouths, eyes wide with disbelief. Richard stood rigid, staring at the coffin as though it had turned into something unnatural. This isn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, there, it was again. Another weak knock from inside. The gravediggers worked faster now, shoveling dirt with frantic energy, as if suddenly realizing they might be digging up a crime rather than performing a burial. The homeless man, his face pale with urgency, stepped forward, his breath ragged. Hurry, he shouted. Get her out now. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs as he stumbled forward, nearly tripping into the grave. His hands shook violently. As he reached the polished wooden surface of the coffin, "Pry it open," he ordered. The workers hesitated for only a second before grabbing a crowbar. The metal scraped against the coffin's lid as they wedged it into place. Sweat dripped from their brows as they struggled to force it open. Richard's vision blurred. His mind raced through every memory of his daughter, the way she laughed, the way she would roll her eyes when he acted too overprotective, the way she hugged him last Christmas. And now he was standing over her grave, ripping it open with his bare hands. Crack! The lid snapped loose. Silence fell. Then, a weak, trembling gasp for air. Richard froze. Inside the coffin, his daughter lay pale and motionless, but her chest rose in a fragile, uneven breath. For a second, his body refused to move. His mind screamed at him to react, but all he could do was stare. Grace was alive. Her fingers, raw and bloodied, twitched against the silk interior, evidence of a horrifying struggle. Her lips parted as if trying to speak, but no words came. Richard's heart shattered. "Grace!" he choked out, dropping to his knees. He reached for her, his hands hovering above her face, terrified that if he touched her, she might shatter like glass. Her eyelids fluttered weakly. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "Dad!" Her voice was barely a whisper. Richard let out a ragged breath, a sob breaking through his throat. "We need an ambulance," someone shouted. The mourners who had once watched in quiet horror now burst into action. Some ran for their phones, others screamed for help, but Richard barely registered any of it. His hands cradled Grace's face as he whispered, "I'm here, sweetheart." "You're safe now, but then—" The homeless man stepped closer. His voice was low, urgent. "No, she isn't." Richard turned sharply. "What do you mean?" he demanded. The man's eyes burned with intensity. "She wasn't buried alive by accident." A chill slithered down Richard's spine. The man swallowed hard. "Someone wanted her dead." Richard sat in the hospital waiting room, his hands clasped so tightly they had turned white. The doctors had taken Grace in for emergency treatment, but no one could give him a straight answer. Would she survive? Would she recover? His mind was still spinning. How did this happen? How could she have been declared dead if she was still alive? The questions battered him like waves against jagged rocks, each one more impossible than the last. Across from him, the homeless man, Adrian West, watched him carefully. "I know what you're thinking," Adrian said, his voice quiet but firm. "You think this was a mistake. A terrible, tragic mistake. Richard exhaled sharply, his patience fraying. It wasn't a mistake, Mr. Henshaw. Richard's eyes snapped to him. You keep saying that, he said coldly. Then, tell me what you know. Adrian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His gaze was unwavering. I need you to listen carefully, he said, because this started long before today. 3 days earlier, Grace Henshaw stepped out of the sleek glass doors of Henshaw Industries, pulling her coat tighter around her. The air was crisp, a soft breeze sweeping through the towering buildings of downtown. She had just finished a long meeting, but something about it didn't sit right with her. Her father's business partner, Victor Langley, had been acting strange, dismissive, on edge, and there was the matter of the financial reports she wasn't supposed to see. She shook the thought away as she walked toward her car, until she saw him. A homeless man sat on the sidewalk, bundled in an old coat, his gaze distant. Most people walked past without a second glance. Grace hesitated. Then, breaking from the flow of the busy city, she stepped toward him. Are you hungry? She asked softly. The man, Adrian West, lifted his gaze, startled. He wasn't used to rich people acknowledging his existence, much less speaking to him. Grace pulled a wrapped sandwich from her bag and handed it to him. Here, she said. Adrian took it slowly, eyeing her with an odd mix of gratitude and suspicion. You don't seem like the type to stop for people like me. Grace gave a small smile. Maybe more people should. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then his expression darkened. Be careful, Miss Henshaw. She frowned. What do you mean? Adrian exhaled, shaking his head. You work in dangerous circles. Grace's stomach twisted. She didn't know why, but his words sent a ripple of unease through her. A car honked behind her. Her driver was waiting. She turned back to Adrian, but he was already looking past her, at the Henshaw Industries building. And then, just as she stepped into the car, he muttered something under his breath. So quiet, she almost didn't hear it. The rich don't always protect their own. Richard stared at Adrian, his blood running cold. You knew my daughter, he whispered. Adrian nodded slowly. She was the only one who ever looked me in the eye. Richard swallowed hard, the weight of it sinking in. And that's why I had to save her, he leaned forward. Because I saw what they did to her, Mr. Henshaw. I saw them put something in her IV. I saw them bury her alive. Richard's heart stopped. For the first time he realized this wasn't just a mistake, this was murder. Richard sat in his office, staring at the financial reports spread across his desk. His mind was a whirlwind of rage and confusion. None of this made sense. His daughter had been buried alive. The doctor who declared her dead was clearly hiding something. And now his closest business partner, Victor Langley, had appeared at the hospital at the exact moment Richard started asking questions. Coincidence? No. Something wasn't right. Across the room, Adrian West stood silently, watching Richard. The dim office light cast long shadows over his weary face. Richard had underestimated him. He wasn't just some desperate homeless man. He had seen something. He knew something. Richard exhaled sharply. You said you saw Dr. Crawford inject something into my daughter's IV. Adrian nodded. Do you know what it was? Adrian hesitated, then stepped forward, picking up a pen from the desk and rolling it between his fingers. I have a pretty good idea, he said. It was likely a paralytic agent, something that slows the heart rate and breathing to almost undetectable levels. If given in the right dose, it can make someone appear clinically dead, even fooling. Most doctors. Richard's stomach churned. And you're sure about that? Adrian set the pen down and met Richard's eyes. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Richard studied Adrian, something gnawing at the back of his mind. How do you know all this? Adrian clenched his jaw, then finally let out a bitter laugh. Because I used to be a doctor. Richard blinked. You, Dr. Adrian West, he muttered, almost like he hated the sound of it. Trauma surgeon, that was a long time ago. Richard stared at him. This man, this wreck of a man, had once been a surgeon. What happened? Richard asked. Adrian exhaled. I exposed corruption in the hospital I worked for. Turns out they didn't like that very much. He scoffed. I lost everything. My job, my license, my reputation. No one would hire me. And eventually, well, here I am. Richard didn't know what to say. Adrian leaned forward. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is that your daughter was poisoned, declared, dead and buried alive. He tapped the desk. And someone paid to make it happen. Richard swallowed hard. He glanced at the financial reports in front of him, the ones Grace had been investigating before her accident. The numbers didn't add up. Millions of dollars had been transferred to untraceable offshore accounts. Then, something clicked. 3. Days before her accident, Grace had requested a private meeting with Victor Langley. Richard felt a chill crawl up his spine. His voice was barely a whisper. She knew. Adrian frowned. Knew what? Richard turned to him, his hands shaking with rage. That someone in my company was stealing money, and if she knew that, then her accident wasn't an accident at all. Richard sat at his desk, his mind racing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he scrolled through old company records, searching for anything, any sign of what Grace had found before her accident. Across the room, Adrian West stood with his arms crossed. His sharp eyes flickered between the documents on the desk and Richard's increasingly frustrated expression. There has to be something, Richard muttered. Some piece of evidence. Some... He stopped. A single transaction caught his eye. A transfer of $10 million, moved from a subsidiary account to an offshore bank 3 days before Grace's crash. His stomach twisted. The authorization? Victor Langley. Richard's mouth went dry. Adrian leaned in. What is it? Richard didn't answer immediately. He clicked through more files, cross-referencing dates, transactions, internal emails. And then, the final blow came. A message sent from Grace's email. To Victor Langley. Subject urgent, we need to talk. Victor, I found something that doesn't make sense. Money is moving where it shouldn't be. We need to discuss this immediately. The email was sent the night before her accident, Adrian exhaled. She knew. Richard clenched his fists. Victor had been lying to his face this whole time. Pretending to be a friend, pretending to be concerned. While he was the one who tried to have his daughter killed, the betrayal hit like a hammer to the chest. Richard had trusted this man with everything. Adrian's voice broke the silence. Richard, if Langley knows Grace survived, she's still in danger. The words sent a fresh wave of panic through Richard. He pushed away from his desk, grabbing his coat. We need to get to Grace, now. Richard moved like a man possessed. Grace was still in danger. If Victor Langley had orchestrated her death, once he wouldn't hesitate to finish the job. Adrian followed close behind as they rushed through the hospital halls, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Richard's mind raced. He had wasted time digging for answers when he should have been protecting his daughter. The moment they reached Grace's room, Richard shoved the door open. His heart stopped. The bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back, the monitors disconnected. A sharp mechanical beep-beep-beep sounded from the IV stand, signaling that the machine had been tampered with. No, Richard breathed. Adrian rushed forward, checking the room. No signs of struggle, no blood. She's not here, Adrian muttered. Richard turned on his heel, grabbing a passing nurse by the arm. Where is my daughter? He demanded. The nurse's eyes widened. Sir, I don't know. A doctor came in a few minutes ago and said she was being transferred. What doctor? Adrian cut in. The nurse swallowed hard. Dr. Crawford. The name hit like a gunshot. That son of a... Richard didn't finish. He was already moving. Richard and Adrian stormed through the hospital, searching for any sign of Grace. Finally, Adrian caught sight of a gurney being wheeled toward an emergency exit. 2 men in doctor's coats pushed it forward. One of them, with a surgical mask covering half his face, Dr. William Crawford, and on the gurney, Grace. She was conscious but weak, barely able to move. Her eyes flickered open, panic flashing through them as she saw Richard. "Dad!" she gasped. Crawford's head snapped up. He pushed the gurney faster. Richard's blood roared in his ears. "Stop them!" Adrian reacted first, shoving past a stunned security guard and sprinting toward the exit. Richard followed, his entire world narrowing down to one single thought: he would not lose his daughter again. Crawford and his accomplice burst through the emergency doors, shoving the gurney toward a black SUV waiting with its engine running. The back door swung open, and Victor Langley stepped out. Richard froze. Langley met his eyes across the distance, his face a mask of cold, unshaken control. "You should have let her stay buried, Richard." Richard's hands clenched into fists. "You damned traitor." Langley nodded to Crawford. "Get her in the car." Crawford and his accomplice grabbed Grace, trying to lift her into the vehicle, but Adrian reached them first. The ex-doctor tackled Crawford to the ground, sending both men crashing onto the pavement. Grace's body slumped back onto the gurney, her breaths ragged. Langley cursed and reached into his coat, pulling out a gun. Richard didn't think. He just acted. With pure adrenaline coursing through him, he lunged at Langley. The gun fired. Bang! But the shot went wide, shattering the window of the SUV. The impact sent both men sprawling onto the ground, punches thrown, grunts of pain echoing through the alley. Langley fought like a man with everything to lose, but Richard had something far more powerful: rage, years of trust, shattered. His daughter's life nearly stolen, his own blind ignorance fueling his fury. With one final devastating blow, Richard slammed his fist into Langley's face. The man collapsed onto the ground unconscious. Sirens wailed in the distance. Hospital security and police officers swarmed the scene within seconds. Crawford was restrained. The getaway driver was dragged out of the SUV, and Victor Langley, once one of the most powerful men in Richard's life, lay motionless, blood trickling from his nose. Richard didn't care. He turned to Grace. She was safe. Shaken but alive, he rushed to her side, dropping to his knees beside the gurney. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "You're safe now." Her lips trembled, and a single tear slid down her cheek. I thought I was going to die." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "Not today, not ever." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, as the weight of everything finally crashed down on him. She was safe. It was over. 2. Weeks later, Victor Langley was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The corruption inside Henshaw Industries was exposed, and everyone involved faced consequences. Dr. William Crawford lost his medical license and was sentenced to prison for his role in the cover-up. As for Adrian West, Richard found him standing near the hospital entrance one evening, a cigarette hanging from his lips, his posture relaxed like a man who had finally found peace. "So," Richard said, stepping beside him. "What now?" Adrian smirked. "Not sure, but I think my work here is done." Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a check, a blank one. "Take this, whatever you need, it's yours." Adrian exhaled a soft chuckle. "I don't want your money, Henshaw." Richard frowned. "Then what do you want?" Adrian took one last drag from his cigarette, then flicked it to the ground. "Nothing, I just wanted to make things right." And with that he walked away, a man who had once lost everything, now walking toward an uncertain but righteous future. That night, Richard sat by Grace's bedside as she slept peacefully. He reached out, brushing his fingers against hers, The first time in weeks his hands didn't shake. He had almost lost her, but he hadn't. And now he would make damn sure no one would ever take her away from him again. What a terrifying thought. Imagine being buried alive, knowing the world has already given up on you. But tonight, justice was served. If you enjoyed this story and want more thrilling mysteries and dramatic tales, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And tell me, Kaz, what would you have done in Richard's place? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.